Welcome, everyone, to the Corinne True Center for Bahá'í History. The center was established by the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States in January of 2024. Its purpose is to foster the study of Bahá'í history, Bahá'í sacred texts, Bahá'í philosophical and theological concepts, and world religions from a Bahá'í and a comparative perspective. I am Dr. Robert Stockman, the director of the center. And joining me today is my dear old friend, Gisu Mohadjer, who is an international development professional. She has 3 degrees from Harvard University, a bachelor's degree, a public health degree, and a business degree, right?
Public administration.
Public administration. There we go. I don't remember all the details. She's traveled extensively and has lived in 6 different countries. She is recently retired, and she and her husband have 2 children, and they live in Potomac, Maryland. Her first book, which came out not too long ago, A Child in the Holy Land, is published by the Bahá'í Publishing Trust, so-called Bahá'í Publishing. And growing up, she was fortunate to hear many stories about Corinne True. And this is why she particularly wanted to have a conversation today about Corinne True, and she and I will be tag teaming back and forth as we discuss this amazing woman's life and the contributions she made to the faith, and really why the Corinne True Center is named for her as well. So, Gisu, thank you so much for joining me today. Welcome. And I will turn on your slideshow so we can get started here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rob. I'm so excited to be here today. It's so exciting to have a center named after Corinne True to study the history of the faith. I think after we talk, it'll become so obvious about why this is just such a wonderful idea and how she can inspire us in our faith and in our study together. So Rob and I have put together a few slides of all the photographs that we could find of her. And we'll be discussing her life and most of all her service. So let me just see if I can move the slides. Yes, I can. Good. Yep. So Mrs. True was known, elevated to the rank of Hand of the Cause of God by the beloved guardian, Shoghi Effendi. The guardian said that she was the most venerable figure among the pioneers of the faith of Baha'u'llah in the West, that she was a spiritual politician. The Hands of the Cause of God called her a disciple of Abdu'l-Bahá, and all of us know her as Mother True and the mother of the temple. So since she was a Hand of the Cause, perhaps we'll start with this tablet of Baha'u'llah revealed for the Hands of the Cause of God.
And I will read that for us. Light and glory, greetings and praise be upon the hands of his cause, through whom the light of fortitude hath shone forth, and the truth hath been established, that the authority to choose rests with God, the powerful, the mighty, the unconstrained, through whom the ocean of bounty hath surged, and the fragrance of the gracious favors of God, the Lord of mankind, hath been diffused. We beseech him, exalted is he, to shield them through the power of his hosts, to protect them through the potency of his dominion, and to aid them through his indomitable strength, which prevaileth over all created things. Sovereignty is God's, the creator of the heavens, and the Lord of the kingdom of names. So now we'll turn to her life. And Gisu, can you tell us how Mrs. True became a Baha'i?
Sure. So to understand how she became a Baha'i, we have to know, as you said, Rob, a little bit about her life. So Corinne Knight was born in 1861, and she married her neighbor, Moses True, in 1882. And this is a very sweet picture of her when she's just 2 years old. In 1883, Their first child, Harriet, was born, and you can see her in the photograph on the upper left, followed by Lawrence, Davis, Edna, Arna, Catherine, Kenneth, and Nathaniel. So they had 8 children in the span of 13 years. But unfortunately, when Harriet was 10 years old, she fell down the basement steps and died shortly thereafter from her injuries. And this, of course, devastated her mother, Mrs. True. Now, what's interesting is that Mrs. True had been brought up in a very, very strict Presbyterian household. Her father was a minister. And, she had to read the Bible every day. She knew the Bible very well. But after her daughter's death, she just started to question everything. And she went in search of something else. So for the next 7 years, she searched for answers. First in the Unity movement, and then in Christian Science, and then finally in Divine Science, which was an offshoot of Christian Science. But in 1899, there was a fresh blow to her. This is her baby Nathaniel with her together. And in 1899, he contracted diphtheria and he died. And it was this period of immense grief where one of the friends of Mrs. True said to her that she had recently attended a lecture about a new religion and that maybe Mrs. True might be interested. So, of course, Mrs. True went to that lecture, heard about Baha'u'llah, recognized him immediately as the manifestation of God for this age, and became a Baha'i. At that point, she was 38 years old. And she went on to serve the faith for 62 years after that, which is why actually it's so hard to talk about her life because, we would have to spend a very long time to talk about it. So we won't get to everything during this talk. So it was Abdu'l-Bahá's first tablet to Mrs. True that finally brought peace and comfort to her after Nathaniel's death. And we now all know this tablet where Abdu'l-Bahá assures her that, "Know that thy pure son shall be with thee in the kingdom of God, and thou shalt witness his smiling face, illumined brow, handsome spirit, and real happiness." Mrs. True would end up losing 5 of her 8 children to illness and accident, but would follow the guidance of Abdu'l-Bahá sent to her after the death of her son Kenneth, who was one of the twins with her daughter Catherine, where Abdu'l-Bahá told her, "It behooveth one like thee to endure every trial, to be pleased with the decree, and to commit all thy affairs to God, so that thou mayest be a calm, approved, and pleasing soul before God." Mrs. True received 50 tablets from Abdu'l-Bahá. This is an early tablet where you can already see that she was very special, and it echoes the passage we read in the opening prayer that the authority to choose rests with God. And I wonder, Rob, if you could read this for us.
Sure. O ye who are set aglow with the fire of God's love, blessed are ye for having been chosen by God for his love in this new age, and joy be to you for having been guided to the great kingdom. Verily, your Lord hath chosen you to show the path to the kingdom of God among the people.
So beautiful. But, Abdu'l-Bahá really nurtured Mrs. True, giving her guidance on how to be a good Baha'i, how to treat her husband. He gave her a prayer to say for her husband, which is in all of our prayer books, how to raise her children, really every aspect of her life when she was an early Baha'i. And to a pilgrim, he had said, "I love Mrs. True very much." From the time she became a Baha'i, Mrs. True started to teach the faith. She was instrumental in bringing the faith to Fruitport, Michigan, where she had a summer home, as well as other communities in Michigan and Wisconsin. And she was very active on the Baha'i institutions for 22 years. And Rob, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about Baha'i administration at that time and the role of women as part of the administration?
The role of women, of course, is the interesting twist. This, of course, is the time before women had the right to vote in the United States. That happened in 1920. But if you look at religions across the United States at that time, of course, almost all of them only had male clergy. There were very, very few exceptions to that. But almost all the churches heavily relied upon women for their volunteers. So the women provided the bulk of the volunteer force that made the churches all function. But they were, of course, run by men. So in many ways, the American Baha'is were used to that model, at least the men were, I should say. The women were not necessarily terribly pleased with that. And for that matter, Mrs. True was involved in divine science and Christian Science, both of which were founded by women and had many women leaders. So this was one of the things that made those particular movements attractive to American women, I think. The Baha'is in the United States first heard about the need to establish houses of justice in 1899, 1900, when they heard about the Kitab-i-Aqdas. Believe it or not, they actually, in 1900, had a translation into English, a poor translation of the Aqdas into English, which talked about the establishment of houses of justice. And so the Baha'is knew they were supposed to form consultative bodies. And Chicago formed one in 1900 and then revised it in 1901. And this governing body was, of course, elected by all the Baha'is, but only men could serve on it. So that was the understanding at the time. The women, however, wanted their own body, so they were encouraged to form a women's auxiliary, which many churches had. And of course, Mrs. True was the president of the Women's Auxiliary Board. So she soon had a very important role in the community anyway. And there was a certain amount of a clash between the men and the women, especially up through 1903 in Chicago, because of the women wanted to organize a meeting hall downtown. They wanted to rent a hall downtown. And the men had very bad experience with the finances of the community and felt that there was no way they could afford it. So the women actually organized their own meeting hall downtown, and some men attended and some men didn't, and some people boycotted the meetings of the House of Spirituality, the governing body of Chicago, and it was quite difficult and controversy. Finally, the women couldn't afford it either, and within 6 months to a year, the men and the women met together and came up with another way so that the House of Spirituality could organize weekly meetings downtown in a way that everybody could afford to do it, and that healed the rift. But it continued to be an issue for quite a while until Abdu'l-Bahá himself, when he was in the United States in 1912, said that women should be elected to all the local governing bodies. He'd actually already told New York to do it in a tablet in 1911, so he was already trying to rectify the situation earlier. So that's a little bit of the situation, and there was a certain amount of friction between Mrs. True, who was a go-getter. She wanted to get things done, and the men who were trying to make sure everything was done in a very efficient, business-like manner, because they were all businessmen. She was a housewife, and they were businessmen, and they very keenly felt the difference between these two roles, shall we say. So is that the sort of thing you were asking about?
Absolutely, yes. And Rob, in which of your books can we read more about this?
Bahá'í Faith in America, Volume 2,
Volume 2.
which covers the period from 1900 to the beginning of 1912. Focuses heavily on Chicago and covers all of the controversies and difficulties in Chicago. But Nat Rutstein, in his book on Corinne True, his biography, also covers them quite well as well. So you can also read Nat's book, and it covers it in much shorter space, but he's fair and he covers it pretty well.
That's great, because this is part of our history that we need to know. And she was so instrumental in that history too. So as we'll continue to see.
Yes, exactly. And of course, the real important role she had was the role of building the house of worship. And so, Gisu, will you tell us about that? Tell us about her effort to get the house of worship built.
Sure. So in 1903, the Chicago Baha'is heard that a house of worship had been built in Ashgabat in Turkmenistan. And they wrote to Abdu'l-Bahá asking for permission to build a temple of their own. And Abdu'l-Bahá wrote 2 really encouraging letters back in response. Now, at this point, Mrs. True wasn't really interested in this project. She was busy with many, many other things. She was serving, as you said, on this women's assembly, and she was teaching. So she wasn't really interested in this project. But a week after Abdu'l-Bahá had written these two general letters to the community, he wrote a letter to her where he said, "Whosoever arises for the service of this building shall be assisted with a great power from his supreme kingdom, and upon him spiritual and heavenly blessings shall descend, which shall fill his heart with wonderful consolation and enlighten his eyes by beholding the glorious and eternal God." And so Mrs. True understood that she was supposed to get involved with this project. Since she was the president, as you said, of the Women's Assembly of Teaching, she consulted with them about what they should do, and they decided to raise some money and put it in the bank and name a treasurer, and then nothing much happened after that. It was not until the summer of 1906 when tragedy struck the True family again. This time it was their eldest son, Lawrence. Now, Lawrence was this beautiful, handsome, educated youth. He was just graduating from university. He was going to get married. He had a job lined up, and he was sailing and got knocked into the water and drowned. And this sudden tragic death of her now fourth child just really was again devastating for the whole family. And Mrs. True decided that at this point she needed to go on pilgrimage and visit Abdu'l-Bahá. So before she did that, she, in preparation for this pilgrimage, organized a petition from the Women's Assembly of Teaching calling for the construction of the temple. She sent it to all the Baha'is throughout the country and received back almost 1,000 signatures. Her husband, Mr. True, glued all the signatures together and created a scroll and placed it in a tin cylinder. Now, the House of Spirituality that you just told us was all men, decided that one of their members, who was also going on pilgrimage at the same time, should take the scroll to the presence of Abdu'l-Bahá. But he got sick, he couldn't go, and so Mrs. True ended up taking the scroll to Abdu'l-Bahá. Now, during her pilgrimage in 1907, one morning she was invited to the presence of Abdu'l-Bahá to share the various gifts that the believers had sent to him. She placed the scroll beside her and started to share the many presents. But before she could present the scroll, Abdu'l-Bahá stood up, came over to her, picked up the scroll, and raising it high, exclaimed, "Mashallah Askar, this is what gives me great joy. Go back and work for the temple. It is a great work, the best thing you could do, Mrs. True." Mrs. True had been asking a lot of questions over the time that they were corresponding together. And so she asked him where it should be built and described the layout of the city and asked whether it should be near the lake shore. And he approved of that idea and said it should be on a large piece of land. But then he went into the next room and quickly came back with a ground plan that showed a temple with 9 sides, 9 avenues radiating from a building. Between each avenue, there was a garden, and in each garden, there was a fountain. Now, remember that the house of worship in Ashgabat had 8 sides, so this was the very first time that a 9-sided design for a house of worship was introduced. Now, I think we can hear Mrs. True talking to Bill Sears about this episode that I just described to you. And you can hear the full extended version of her interview with Mr. Sears on the Corinne True Center website. So let's see if we can listen.
I put the scroll, the roll of names, I put it back on me like this. I thought, well, now, when I got through delivering these different messages, giving him the things that have been said, but then I would take this out and explain it to him. Well, he listened to me for a little while, and I gave him several things, and then he got up, came over beside me, and reached behind me, took a hold of it, Mashallah Askar, and held it up. And he said the very best thing you could do with his truth.
No warnings, no. You knew what I am. That's right.
And then he talked with me about it, how great the work was, you know. And then let's see.
He told you he wanted you to go home?
Well, then he told me that he wanted to show me something. That was it. He took the scroll, and then he said, "I will show you something." And he went out and brought back a drawing which someone had made of the ground floor. 9 avenues and fountains and that, you know. He brought a drawing.
So beautiful to hear her voice. Wow. So Mrs. True had been planning to move to Grand Rapids because that was better for her husband's health, because he was just also devastated by Lawrence's death. But Abdu'l-Bahá explained that it was really important for her to stay in Chicago. And he said, devote yourself to this project, make a beginning, and all will come right. So just as an anecdote, sometime later, when 3 members of the House of Spirituality were on pilgrimage, they asked Abdu'l-Bahá about the temple. And he said, when you return, consult with Mrs. True. I have given her complete instructions. So I love that.
And they weren't very happy about it either, I think.
Oh, no, but Abdu'l-Bahá really empowered her to take forward this work. So,
and he taught them a lesson.
Absolutely.
Taught them a lesson.
Absolutely. So there are 2 stories about this pilgrimage that I think it would be fun to tell. One that I had heard, and of course it's written in these books. Abdu'l-Bahá spoke to Mrs. True about universal love and said, Mrs. True, when you go back, I want you to look at every human being and say to yourself, you are a letter from my beloved, and I must love you because the beloved wrote you. The letter may be torn, it may be blurred, but because the beloved wrote the letter, you must love it. So I think that's just such a beautiful story. The other story I wanted to tell is Mrs. True took Arna with her. Arna was 16, 17 years old, and she wasn't very happy to hang out with the grown-ups. And so Abdu'l-Bahá asked her if she would like to go with the children, and she loved that. So she taught them all kinds of games. And one day, Abdu'l-Bahá entered the courtyard and saw the children jump roping. And he stood and he watched for a while, and then he decided that he would take a turn twirling the rope for the kids to jump. So these beautiful stories of their pilgrimage. So after her return from pilgrimage, Mrs. True devoted herself to the challenge of building the house of worship. And under the guidance of the Women's Assembly of Teaching, she solicited contributions from every believer in North America, writing hundreds of handwritten letters and receipts and loving comments about her pilgrimage and about the importance of the house of worship. She was soon made the Temple Fund Secretary by the House of Spirituality, which she was in some form in that role for almost 2 decades. And she wrote a booklet about her pilgrimage with the proceeds going to the Temple Fund. She launched her own search for suitable land for the house of worship, following the instructions of Abdu'l-Bahá that it should be on the lakeshore. For many weeks, sometimes every day, she would put on her heavy work boots and travel by horse car to the end of the line, and then walk for several hours, exploring the undeveloped areas to the north. And she was often accompanied by Mrs. Cecilia Harrison, who you see in this photograph with her. Her search was so intense that she eventually collapsed and had to spend time recuperating. But she had discovered a wooden tract at Grosse Pointe, a bluff overlooking Lake Michigan. And she felt that this was the chosen place. So at a meeting on the 26th of November, 1907, various delegates from the different Baha'i communities across the country visited several sites and agreed that this site would be the most suitable. By April 1908, 2 of the 14 lots had been bought and options had been secured to buy the remaining 12. And Mrs. True, through these efforts, through her letters, through her solicitation of the funds, became really the focal point of the effort to build the house of worship. And that's what earned her the nickname, the loving nickname of Mother True, the mother of the temple. Now, around this time also, there were changes in the institutions, and the first National Baha'i Institution was formed. Rob, can you tell us how that came about?
Yeah, well, of course, the 1907 meeting, I guess, was sponsored by the House of Spirituality, and it was held at the True House as well. So she played a central role in that 1907 meeting, which was an informal meeting. It wasn't. It didn't actually have a goal of creating a national organization. Remember, at this particular time, 1907, 1908, 1909, there's not a single national Baha'i governing council in the world. And there are only a few local governing councils in the world: Chicago, New York, Kenosha, Racine sometimes, northern Hudson County, New Jersey sometimes, Boston, Washington sometimes. So we had like 6 or so in the United States. Tehran was a central spiritual assembly that served as a national and a local body at the same time, with members of the Hands of the Cause on it. And they actually at first appointed the members, and then later there was an election. I think it was elected by 1907 or so, 1909. But there was no national organization in the United States. And the Baha'is were beginning to realize that this temple was not just a Chicago temple. Because Abdu'l-Bahá told everybody in the United States to support the construction of it. When the Baha'is in the Bay Area said, we want to build a temple too, Abdu'l-Bahá said, fine, but first finish the one in Chicago. He said the same thing to New York. So everybody had to turn to Chicago to build the one there, and that meant there needed to be a national organization. So the decision was to, the House of Spirituality, the Chicago governing body, called a formal meeting in 1909. It was held actually over Nowruz, or was it held over Rezvan? It was held over Nowruz, March, to talk about the establishment of this organization. And they named it the Baha'i Temple Unity. So that was the actual establishment of a national coordinating body. The National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States grew directly out of the Baha'i Temple Unity. And in fact, I just attended the National Convention, and that National Convention dates back to the 1909 one. It's the first one. So I don't remember the date. I don't remember the number of our most recent National Convention. If I can find it here, I'll tell you. But it dates all the way back to the 1909 convention. So maybe if I find that, I'll tell you later. But at any rate, that's the story of the national organization. I should add that a lot of Baha'is felt that there was a need for a national organization. Edward Getzinger even wrote Abdu'l-Bahá and made a whole proposal for a national organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. So there was quite an effort. So and we have these pictures you can talk about.
Yeah. And Mrs. True was appointed to, she was elected to Baha'i Temple Unity, and she was appointed as the financial secretary and continued, of course, with the efforts for the fundraising and so on, writing hundreds, if not thousands, of notes and solicitations and receipts, and just loving notes.
And it's worth pointing out that there were 3 out of the 9 members of the Baha'i Temple Unity were women. So that's really kind of cool that in 1909, the American Baha'is elected a body which had so many women on it.
Yes.
And of course, in 1912, the first African American was elected to it as well, Louis Gregory.
Brilliant. So, shall we get back to the House of Worship? So, thank you, Rob. So, on August 1st, 1909, a committee of 15 gathered at the True home to consider plans submitted by various architects. Some of the prominent Baha'i architects had submitted designs for consideration, including Hand of the Cause of God, William Sutherland Maxwell, who was later the architect of the Shrine of the Bab, and Louis Bourgeois, who had become a Baha'i in 1906. but they didn't select a design at this point. Abdu'l-Bahá had told them to wait until they had collected enough money to start the construction before they selected the design. And we'll see when they select the design and what they select. Of course, it's not a surprise because we all know what the house of worship looks like. But anyway.
Well, the design however, that they selected is a little different.
Yeah, well, we'll see that. Let's see.
Yes.
In 1912, Abdu'l-Bahá visited North America. Of course, we know that. And Mrs. True really wanted to go and meet him on his arrival in New York. Newspapers said that there were 1,000 people waiting for Abdu'l-Bahá to disembark. But her son Davis was very ill. On April 30th, 1912, the day after Abdu'l-Bahá arrived in Chicago, he had arrived the night before, he went to visit Mrs. True and Davis. And he spent a long time up in Davis's room and came down and told Mrs. True that her son was a wonderful young man and that he had found him much better than expected. Abdu'l-Bahá had 3 lectures later that afternoon, and he suggested that Mrs. True accompany him, which she did. And while they were out, Davis died. So Mrs. True felt that when Abdu'l-Bahá had said much better than expected, he meant Davis's physical health. But of course, Abdu'l-Bahá had meant his spiritual health and his readiness for the next world. The next day was the dedication ceremony of the house of worship. And Mrs. True was one of the 400 people waiting for Abdu'l-Bahá to arrive. As soon as his car pulled up, Mrs. True was asked for, and together they spent some time away from the others before the start of the ceremony. The next day was Davis's funeral. Abdu'l-Bahá asked Mrs. True and her 3 remaining children to join him in the afternoon. He visited Davis's grave and prayed for him and the other members of the family. The next time Mrs. True saw Abdu'l-Bahá was in New York City, where he asked her to look after his household for 5 days. Mrs. True wrote about this experience, and she said, as Abdu'l-Bahá said, the servant is always with his master. And being a servant in this household, I found many times a day we heard the most wonderful lessons given by Abdu'l-Bahá, which could not have been ours had we not been serving in the capacity we were. While she was in New York, as you said, Rob, Abdu'l-Bahá then decided that the Chicago House of Spirituality should have women, right?
And be reelected. Yeah.
And be reelected.
Yep. And if I can add something, Gisu, he often had Baha'is, Western Baha'is, 2 or 3 or 4, serving as hosts and servants in his houses because he usually rented a house when he was in the United States. And they all had amazing experiences. And many of them went on to do great services for the faith later. Harlan Ober is one example. What's her name? Grace Robarts, who was the niece of Hand of the Cause of God Robarts, who married Harlan Ober. She was another one who served in Abdu'l-Bahā's house in New York. And in fact, Abdu'l-Bahá encouraged the 2 of them to get married, and they did the same day or the next day. And others too. George Latimer was encouraged to come out and visit Abdu'l-Bahá for a couple of days. So he accompanied people by having them accompany him. So
beautiful. And of course, Mrs. True really loved Abdu'l-Bahá so much. And I'm sure it was such a solace and strength to her to be able to spend this time, so close time with him. So
especially after Davis's passing.
After Davis's passing, yeah. So when Abdu'l-Bahá went back to Chicago in September for 4 days, September 12th to 16th, he stayed at the True home. And as with all of his other visits, the place was absolutely packed with people trying to see him and be with him and morning, noon, night, at all times. Abdu'l-Bahá at that time asked Mrs. True to speak in public. And this is another one of the stories that I heard growing up. And she said, I can't do it. And he said to her, Mrs. True, I want you to speak in public. I want you to tell people about the faith. And when she said, she really couldn't, he said, forget what you can't do. Stand up and turn your heart wholly toward me. Look over the heads of the audience, and I'll never fail you. In November of 1919, Mrs. True and Edna went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the presence of Abdu'l-Bahá. Now, this time they had the great pleasure and bounty of having Shoghi Effendi guide them to the holy places in Akka and Haifa. They spent time together with Abdu'l-Bahá, who assured Mrs. True that the temple would be built and would be the great teacher it was destined to be. And he told her that he was also very pleased with the development of the Baha'i Temple Unity as an administrative body. And we're very fortunate to have this photograph of Mrs. True and her daughter Edna in Abdu'l-Bahā's presence on Mount Carmel beside the tomb of the Bab. And you can see she's circled in gold. Now we get to the design of the house of worship. The years of the First World War were very difficult in terms of fundraising needed for the construction. And it wasn't until really in 1920 that the goal of raising $200,000 was finally met. At the April 1920 convention of the Baha'i Temple Unity, Louis Bourgeois' design for the house of worship was approved out of 15 designs that were presented. So you have spent so much time in Chicago at the house of worship. What are some of the differences that you see?
Well, I'll tell you, if you look very closely, of course, the immediate thing that will strike you is that this design looks squatter than the house of worship that exists. And that is exactly correct, because the proportions are different. They had to make the horizontal proportions smaller, but they kept the vertical proportions about the same, because originally the house of worship would have been so large that it would have practically covered all of the current gardens.
Oh, wow.
But if you look very closely at the doors, you'll notice that on each side of the doors, there are 4 windows. And in actual fact, there are only 2. So that's the real clue for how it's different. When you walk up to the house of worship, it doesn't have 4 windows on each side of each door. So,
very nice.
But it is interesting to note that water structure there. The guardian actually approved not only the fountains, but he also approved a pool of water as you approach the house of worship. But there wasn't one until the 1990s, when they thought, wouldn't it be nice to put something like that in? And then they looked around and discovered the guardian had already approved it. So they were actually restoring an architectural element the guardian had approved and that had originally been planned, but had been removed.
So fun. We should do a session on the house of worship. There'll be so many stories.
And if I can go back real quick to your previous, well, you don't have to go back on slides. Back to Mrs. True's house when Abdu'l-Bahá stayed there.
Mm-hmm.
Abdu'l-Bahá met someone at that house that you knew.
Who?
Fujita.
Oh, yes, of course.
Fujita was living with Mrs. True when Abdu'l-Bahá came through in September.
Yes.
And Abdu'l-Bahá met him then and invited him to continue his trip to the West Coast. And so Fujita, the Japanese-American Baha'i, was invited by Abdu'l-Bahá to go all the way out to California, where the prejudice against the Japanese and the Chinese was almost as great as the prejudice against African Americans. And he had an Asian American as part of his entourage in California.
And it was Mrs. True who took Fujita to the Holy Land on her next pilgrimage. And of course, I met Fujita as a child in the house of the master. And I used to follow him around all over the gardens and just do whatever he was doing. He would be, pruning and cleaning and working in the gardens. And I would just follow him around and do whatever he was doing. So not realizing the great bounty I had of spending time with someone who had been so intimately associated with Abdu'l-Bahá and with Shoghi Effendi, but just knowing that I loved him and wanted to hang out with him. So that's a very happy memory. Thank you for reminding that.
Yeah, and it reminds also all of us how close all of this still is, I mean, maybe not so much for your kids and my kids, but for us, we still knew people who knew Abdu'l-Bahá.
Yeah.
I met Mrs. True, Edna True, and a few other believers who had met Abdu'l-Bahá.
Right. Incredibly close and so precious.
Yep. And for our kids, they're lucky to meet people who knew the guardian now.
Yes. So Of course, Mrs. True continued to be involved with the House of Worship. This is now 1920, where they're starting construction, and they're, again, ceremonially turning the earth before the start of construction. And right around this time, just after, we have the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá. And Rob, things changed again administratively in the United States after the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá. And I thought maybe you could explain that again to us.
Sure. Well, of course, there was the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá, of course, called for the establishment of national spiritual assemblies. And nobody really knew about that in any detail until after the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, and the will and testament was then read aloud in January of 1922, and extracts of it were translated and gradually made available to the Friends in the West. So Shoghi Effendi, having read the will and testament, realized that it was a blueprint for building not only national spiritual assemblies, but also ultimately the Universal House of Justice, which can't be elected without the national spiritual assemblies. And so the Guardian decided it was time to really shift gears and start building the administrative structures of the faith, which up to this point were very informal, had relatively little authority. Abdu'l-Bahá had given the Baha'i Temple Unity the authority to do literature review in 1919, and that was the first time literature review was given to a national governing body. So there was some gradual increase in responsibilities, even in the days of Abdu'l-Bahá. But now it was time to really to get things organized. And so Abdu'l-Bahá invited a large number of, well, not a large number, a dozen or so believers from the various countries where there were communities to come consult with him in the Holy Land. So they didn't all arrive at the same time. Shoghi Effendi met with the ones when they were there. Some left before others arrived. But Mrs. True was one of these people whom Shoghi Effendi invited to Haifa to consult with him about the organization of the faith, a future organization of the faith. And so it was a very, really great responsibility that he gave her to be one of those people. And the result, of course, was the establishment of national spiritual assemblies. The American Baha'is immediately in the 1922 convention renamed their Baha'i Temple Unity the National Spiritual Assembly, but it took them several years to really get the functioning right and to get the legal basis right. If you read Catherine Hoganson's book about Horace Holly, you can read all those details about the difficulties. And Mrs. True was continued to be elected in 1922 to that body, and that was, I believe, her last year that she was elected to this American National Coordinating Body. So she was on a body that was named the National Spiritual Assembly, but not on any of the bodies that the Guardian recognized as a National Spiritual Assembly.
There's a typo in my slide. It's May 4th, 1922, not 92.
Oh, yeah.
Where she's elected to this National Spiritual Assembly. And she wrote to Shoghi Effendi. And it's just such a loving, letter. It's so firm in the covenant. She writes, "These 9 men and women are your servants at all times, begging confirmation from the center of the covenant, that they may render you faithful service in all affairs for the advancement of the cause." So she was on this National Spiritual Assembly in 22 and 23, but it was 1925 that the Guardian recognized it, right, as
Yes.
the first National Assembly.
Yes, and I think this letter, the other thing about this letter that strikes me is how marvelous it is that there were an awful lot of Baha'is who were very concerned about a 23-year-old whippersnapper being in charge of the faith, but that's certainly not her attitude.
No.
She understood and accepted the role of the Guardian, regardless of his age. And that is a real example of her faith and understanding.
And her love for the master and for the covenant and for the Guardian, yeah. So Mrs. True had several other pilgrimages. We've talked about 3 of them already. She went on pilgrimage in the 1920s and 30s, in 1925 and 1927. In 1927, Shoghi Effendi told her that the Baha'is should start having meetings in the foundation hall of the House of Worship that had already been completed. And the 1928 National Convention was held there. Now, the Greatest Holy Leaf had given Mrs. True a large package of tea and a bottle of attar of roses to be used for this inauguration ceremony, as they called it. And Mrs. True started by giving the love of the Greatest Holy Leaf to all the delegates and then personally serving each one a cup of the special tea, while another friend anointed them with the attar of rose. And one of the participants wrote, "Words cannot describe the spiritual radiance which illumined the faces of all." And in her pilgrimages in 1931 and 1935, there's a very sweet story that I wanted to tell you. So as you said, Mrs. True had met Shoghi Effendi when he was 10 years old. And then in her next pilgrimage, Shoghi Effendi had taken her to all the holy places. So when he first became guardian, she had immediately and staunchly defended the covenant. Over the years, she received 70 letters from him. So during this first night at dinner in 1935, after they had finished eating, she looked over at Shoghi Effendi's plate and said, "Shoghi Effendi, you are not eating enough." And the guardian replied, "But Mrs. True, that's all I want." And she said, "You need to eat more. Eating only twice a day isn't enough." So she was very maternal and
mothering him.
Guardian of our faith. Yeah. So what was Mrs. True's involvement in subsequent years, Robert?
Well, of course, it's very interesting. She was no longer on a national governing body. Of course, she presumably was still quite involved in the temple work and one way or the other, writing people, I'm sure. But at that point, she really was doing a lot more, I think, at national committees and maybe even local committees. She helped to organize the tablets of Abdu'l-Bahá that had been received. That was one of the tasks that she was involved in. She helped plan a lot of devotional meetings. I'm personally have been told that she had deepenings at her house, which were really quite extensive and fairly rigorous, with a lot of careful reading and discussion of the meaning of texts and things. So that was one of the things that she did. She also spoke at the centenary celebrations in 1944, celebration of course, 1844 to 1944. And that's another thing she did. And of course, no doubt she was watching the house of worship being built all this time, the superstructure, and then the exterior ornamentation, and then finally the interior ornamentation and the gardens being finished. So those are the main tasks going on at the time, and I'm sure she was continuing to be involved in those. She was also very supportive of the various plans. The first 7-year plan, of course, focused on Latin America, but the second 7-year plan focused on Europe. This was 1946 to 53, and she traveled to Europe with Edna and visited pioneers in various countries: Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. And she also spoke at the European Teaching Conference in 1950. And this, of course, is before she was named a hand also. So in spite of her age, in 1950, how old was she? She was born in 61. So she was 39, I guess, in 1900. So adds 50 to that, that's 89 years old or something like that in 1950. And traveling to Europe at that age is pretty amazing.
Yeah. But you see, she's in good health and, looking great. I mean, yeah. So in 1952, she was elevated by the beloved guardian to the rank of Hand of the Cause of God. And, at this point, she was 90 years old. But for the guardian, it didn't matter what her age was. She was capable, she was active, and she was a hand of the cause. So what's interesting is that in this announcement, he says, May sacred function enable you enrich record services already rendered, Faith Baha'u'llah. So the Guardian is saying, this isn't, a reward. This is, a recognition of what you've done, and you're supposed to do more. And Abdu'l-Bahá explains the spiritual phenomenon of the hands of the cause to us. When he was on board the Cedric on his way to America in 1912, Abdu'l-Bahá said the following: "The hands of the cause in this dispensation are not heirs to any name or title. Rather, they are sanctified souls, the rays of whose holiness and spirituality throw light on the hearts of all. Hearts are attracted by the beauty of their morals, the sincerity of their intentions, and their sense of equity and justice. Souls are involuntarily enamored of their praiseworthy morals and laudable attributes. Faces turn in spontaneous attraction to their outstanding qualities and actions. Hand of the cause is not a title that may be awarded to whomever it may please to have it, nor is it a chair of honor upon which whoever wishes may sit. The hands of the cause are the hands of God." So she remained extremely active for the next decade of her service.
It's a rather frightening challenge, isn't it?
I know, at 90, yeah.
Yeah.
So right after she was made a hand of the cause of God, in October of 1952, Mrs. True went on her last pilgrimage to the Holy Land and to the presence of the beloved guardian. He had invited her especially to come at that time so that she would be the only visitor, and he devoted his time and attention to her. Now, one evening at dinner, the guardian had a surprise for her. He asked her, "I understand, Mrs. True, you had something to do with the temple in the United States." And she's puzzled by this, and she answers very seriously, "Yes, Shoghi Effendi." And he says, "Didn't you have something to do with the money?" And she again answers very seriously, "Yes, I received the money and was the financial secretary." At this point, the beloved guardian reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet and said, "This was carried by Abdu'l-Bahá when he visited America." And he placed it in her hands and told her that he wanted her to keep it. So tears filled her eyes, and she placed it on her forehead. And one of the people who was also there at dinner said that all of them were in tears. Finally, Shoghi Effendi urged her to open the wallet, and inside was a $5 piece with the date 1907 inscribed on it, the year of her first pilgrimage. And it's believed that the coin was one of the 10 brought to the master by Mrs. True as a gift from the Women's Assembly of Teaching. Shoghi Effendi described Mrs. True as a spiritual politician, and he explained, "You have learned to be spiritual and at the same time to get things done." And then he went on and said, "It should be stated that Mrs. True is to be regarded as the most venerable figure among the pioneers of the faith of Baha'u'llah in the West." Now, the beloved guardian was using the word pioneer differently than us. Mrs. True lived in Chicago or in the Chicago area her entire life. I mean, she really wasn't an international pioneer the way we think of pioneers these days, or even a home front pioneer. But she was a pioneer in that she did something completely new and groundbreaking. The next year, in May 2nd of 1953, she attended the dedication ceremony of the House of Worship. And this was 46 years after she had carried that petition to Abdu'l-Bahá. Her daughter said, "I have never seen her so affected by anything as she was by the fact that she was going to the dedication. As she approached the temple, everyone stopped her, wanting to speak to her, but she couldn't. She did not weep, but she could not speak. She could hardly raise her head. It was a tremendously moving moment." And here she is in 1953. In 1956, she attended the Baha'i National Convention. And in 1957, she's now 95 years old, the beloved guardian sent her to the Greater Antilles for the formation of the National Spiritual Assembly as his representative. And she got up and spoke at the convention, and during the ballot counting, anointed the friends with attar of rose sent by the beloved guardians, carrying out all of her responsibilities as his representative. And she continued. In 1959, she attended the National Convention, and here she is with the other Hands of the Cause at the age of 97, sitting at the podium. And she died, as you said, Rob, at the age of almost 100 years old in 1961. The Hands of the Cause in the Holy Land cabled, grieved, lost, distinguished disciple Abdu'l-Bahá, hand cause Corinne True. Her long association, early history, faith in America, raising Mother Temple West, staunch, unfailing championship covenant, steadfast support, beloved guardian, every stage unfoldment, world order, unforgettable, enrich annals faith, Western world. Her memorial service was held at the House of Worship at the time of the U.S. National Convention, a fitting venue for one who had spearheaded the construction of the House of Worship and the development of the Baha'i national institutions. In the Tablet of Baha'u'llah, the Lohe Donya, Baha'u'llah has written about the Hands of the Cause. And Baha'u'llah says, righteous men of learning who dedicate themselves to the guidance of others and are freed and well guarded from the promptings of a base and covetous nature are, in the sight of him who is the desire of the world, stars of the heaven of true knowledge. It is essential to treat them with deference. They are indeed fountains of soft-flowing water, stars that shine resplendent, fruits of the blessed tree, exponents of celestial power, and oceans of heavenly wisdom. Happy is he that followeth them. Verily, such a soul is numbered in the book of God, the Lord of the mighty throne, among those with whom it shall be well.
So let me ask you a question here, Gisu. Thank you so much for putting this marvelous thing together. In your opinion, you had commented to me how it was so fitting that the Corinne True Center for Baha'i Studies named for her. Will you expound on that comment you made to me?
Sure. You know, it's just so appropriate. I mean, when we think about the establishment of the faith in the United States, you explained to us how she was involved at every stage in the formation of the assemblies at the local level in Chicago, the integration of women onto the assemblies at the national level with Baha'i Temple Unity, with the first early stirrings of the National Spiritual Assembly. And then when we think about the House of Worship and all her efforts to be part of the House of Worship, her tremendous teaching efforts, we haven't talked about how, you know, she was such an incredible teacher and brought so many communities in the United States into the faith. Her role as a hand of the cause of God, where, you know, she was really instrumental in safeguarding the faith through various stages and times. Her incredible support of the covenant and steadfastness. And, you know, in this beautiful quotation from Baha'u'llah, where he talks about, you know, how they are the stars of the heaven of true knowledge, right? And he talks about the oceans of how they are the oceans of heavenly wisdom. So, you know, for us to be able to have a center in her name is just so incredibly appropriate and just so perfect in so many ways that it's just very exciting to have that.
Yeah, I fully agree with you and concur very much. And I love it that you've been able to summarize this so well. I'm really very grateful for that. I should mention that if people want to make any comments or questions, they can do so at our YouTube channel, and those will be fed to us. We are not broadcasting live over our Facebook page for the Corinne True Center's Facebook page. It is being broadcast live over my personal Facebook page, but we still haven't been able to get the stream to go over the group page because of the way Facebook has changed the way these pages are set up now. So we can, take a few questions possibly. We may not be able to answer them, but we can always try. And I guess I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to ask you about the slideshow. I think it's quite interesting to note that in many ways, the major accomplishments in her life were all that sort of 20-year period of time from 1898, say through 1922, when she was last elected to the national governing body. So you have that 22, 23-year period of time in her life when she does so many things. And of course, she continues to do things throughout her whole life, but it's really that early period that is so packed with things that she accomplishes for the faith and things that she gets started for the faith. And it really is quite an impressive thing to see.
What's also impressive for me, I have two children who are now adults, is that during that whole time, she was the mother of a very busy household. She had young children. Her children were very active. Her house is known as a center for all the children's friends who come. Her father, when her mother passed away, her father came to live with them. I mean, there's a lot going on in her personal life that would overwhelm anyone else. But she herself was, able to basically serve the faith almost full time. More than full time throughout that period, while juggling all of this. And we even have another Baha'i who says that she and Mrs. Maxwell were the best mothers they had known. So she's not neglecting anyone. She's not, and her love and consideration for her husband, who was her supporter, was so strong, and encouraged by Abdu'l-Bahá that he became a Baha'i before he passed away. And so she was able to do it all, and is really, I think, an inspiration for those of us who are mothers, who are, young mothers who want to serve the faith while having our families and also serving them. She's really remarkable.
Well, and I think I would add to that she's remarkable in the context of losing 5 of her children out of 8 in this period of time. And her husband, who passed away in 1909, if I remember right. And these are enormous blows to her, and it's her spiritual resiliency and her. I think it's converting that pain into service, partly as well, and getting a stronger faith that God wants her to devote her life to the faith. Every time she loses a child. It's amazing to think that Abdu'l-Bahá arrives in Chicago. He visits her. Her son dies that day, and then she's at the house of worship the next day because he's gonna lay the cornerstone of the house of worship she's wanted to see built all this time. He's going to lay that cornerstone the next day after her son's passing, and she's there. And of course, as soon as he arrives, he immediately asks for Mrs. True to join him in the car so that he can comfort her for a while privately. And everybody has to wait, because that was more important. But it's really such an amazing combination of agony and ecstasy, you might say, in her life.
I read that she was a little sensitive to this idea that she was, so active in the service of the faith as a way of sort of dealing with the grief from the death of her family members. I think for her, she saw them as two different things. One was the private grief, and one was the service to the faith. And it was the service to the faith that was really her focus and her center. So I think that was really where she wanted to put her time and attention. And Abdu'l-Bahá was supporting her incredibly. I mean, to
Yeah.
receive 50 letters from Abdu'l-Bahá, many of them unsolicited. You know, she wasn't writing to him and he was responding. He was reaching out to her before she had even written to him.
Yeah, sometimes.
And that's incredible. She was just an amazing, amazing person. So,
And it's not like he had a lot of time on his hands either.
yeah.
I mean, he was very strategically thinking about the people he really was impressed by and how he could help them, how he could encourage them, how he could strengthen and transform them, how he could accompany them via letter, you know?
Yeah. And he says about her that she was chosen, right?
Yeah.
He says that you were chosen by God for his love, chosen to show the path to the kingdom of God among the people. So another reason why, you know, it's so perfect to have the Corinne True Center named after her, because it'll show us the path.
Yep, that's very true.
Wonderful.
Well, I think that pretty much wraps up our broadcast today about Corinne True. And we've been receiving thanks from people for this particular program, which is nice to see. I want to thank everybody for joining the Corinne True Center for Baha'i History today. And I'll remind everybody that next week we will be talking with Wendy Momen about the teachings of the Baha'i Faith as they relate to girls. And Gisu is going to join me as a co-host of that particular webinar while we basically interview Wendy on her understanding of these very important principles and laws and other aspects of the faith that relate to girls around the world, and the liberation, of course, and the protection of girls. So that's what we're going to focus on. Thank you again today for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next week, we hope, and as soon as possible anyway. So thanks, everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you, Rob. Bye.